All right. So we stopped our discussion last week with talking a little bit about Gaius Marius. Gaius Marius is this sort of popular hero who comes out of nowhere from the town of Arpinum. He basically helps the Senate out of the dealing with the problem with Jugurtha down in Africa, and also the battles up in northern Gaul. And that's the Battle of Orazio in particular in 105 BC. And he also deals, as I said, with Jugurtha down in Africa. He's consul for 5 times, consul 5 times in a row, which is sort of unprecedented thing at Rome. And we're starting to see now these popular heroes taking control of things, and we're moving in the direction of sort of one-man rule. We saw that a little bit in the past, also with Tiberius Gracchus and his brother Marius takes that to the next extreme. Part of what hang on one second, guys. Sorry about that, guys. I'm back. My wife decided to change the baby. It makes her scream and cry, so moved to a quieter part of the house. You may get a little bit of noise in the background. Anyway, we'll edit that out of the recording. Where was I? The social war. So at around this time, the time we're talking about here is like 91 to 81 BC. 91 to 88 BC, I'm sorry. The Italian allies have gotten really upset. In the textbook, he talks about some episodes of just sort of abuse by Roman magistrates of the Italian allies. So there's one story, for example, of a Roman magistrate whose wife wants to bathe in the public bath, and like they're in presumably one of these cities that were like they were not originally Romans, they were Italian cities that the Romans had conquered, and they didn't have full citizenship, although they were still serving in the army. This guy's wife says she wants to take a bath in the public bathhouse, which was like a major thing in Roman society, so they just declare all at once that everybody has to leave the bathhouse, and this woman goes and takes a bath. The sort of magistrate's wife, she decides it's not clean enough, and so the leading citizens of the town are dragged out into the town square and like beaten publicly. Okay, so this is sort of an example of the kind of abuse that was going on of the Italian sort of allies of Rome, and eventually they had enough. Now, around this time, there is a law passed, or a law proposed by a guy by the name of Drusus, who proposes giving citizenship to all of the Italian allies. And this is rejected at Rome, because though Rome had grown and was sort of becoming more powerful, there was also tensions between these two groups, those who had the sort of right to vote and those who didn't. And eventually a war broke out. The Italians joined together, actually. They even created a capital in the city of Corfinium, which they called Italica. So they were really trying to style themselves as an alternative to the Romans. But they really had no chance in battle against the Romans. Can you guys still hear me okay? Did it break down? Okay. How long was I gone? Okay, great. So we had started talking about the social war, and you got all that. Left it at Italica. Great, thanks. We'll edit that out too. So there was they had a capital at Italica, but they really weren't. What I was saying is they really were no match for the Romans in war, because the Romans had much more advanced ability to mobilize large armies, and also to, even though the Italians were making up a large part of the Roman army, all of the generals were Romans. So the Italians had no real ability to mobilize forces or to command large groups of people. So the social war didn't actually last that long, but it didn't matter, because one of the main thing that the Italians were fighting for was citizenship. This is like the ability to have full protection under the law. And you remember that citizenship, of course, included the right to vote, but it also included the right to appeal, which is called provocatio, basically to appeal to the people any decision of a Roman magistrate. And that was important when the magistrates were, perpetrating abuses like the one I just described. And the reason the war was so short, even though there were a few battles where the Romans won, was immediately they offered citizenship to anyone who was willing to basically give up their rebellion and join their side. So the Italians, although they lost the war, they got what they were looking for, which was basically becoming Roman citizens. And so after the social war, which was not a very long war and not that dramatic, all of the Romans, everyone in Italy became citizens. Now, this was a huge change based on the way things had been set up prior to this, because prior to this, you had sort of Roman citizens in the city of Rome, and then the Italians sort of like subjugated allies who had to serve in the army, but didn't really have any say. And they relied on the patron-client relationship, but they didn't have any say in politics, no vote. What ended up happening after the social war was that citizenship was now spread throughout Italy. In realistic terms, most of them didn't have really a ability to vote because they were so far away from Rome. But in theory, it spread out power throughout Italy. And so this is the first point where we have Rome moving from one city, which controls a large amount of territory through this sort of subjugation of like deditio in fidem that we talked about, to more of an empire, which is a larger piece of land with lots of citizens throughout, that has a capital city, but is really functioning more like an empire. Okay, so that's the social war. Any questions about the social war before we move on? Okay, seeing none. Marius, who I mentioned before, was really like the victorious general of the social war. He had distinguished himself prior to the social war in the affair with Jugurtha, and winning the tribes, winning against the Cimbri and the Teutones, who had been problematic northern tribes that had led to the defeats at the Battle of Aurazio. But he also was victorious in the social war and sort of made short work of the Allied armies, even though it didn't matter. Marius had a lieutenant named Sulla. He also served under Marius in the social war. And as the social war came to an end, Marius was kind of aging out. It sort of became Sulla's turn to have his go. He was also a great military commander, had sort of distinguished himself well during the war. And when Marius sort of retired, or was sort of finishing up his career, still very powerful, Sulla sort of came into his own, let's say. Now, around this time, a person who we've talked about before, And when I say around this time, we're talking about 89 BC. Mithridates of Pontus, this sort of petty king over in the eastern part of the empire, cropped back up. And he starts causing various problems. And oh, good. Angela, glad you're here. Sorry you missed the beginning, but it will be recorded and shared, so you can catch up on the first 10 minutes or so. Very hi, Joshua. No worries. We will. I'll be sharing it on YouTube, so you'll be able to check in. You can see the slides. Also share the slides in the drive. Okay. All right. Great. So where were we? Ah, yes. Okay. So we the social war has ended. Marius is sort of victorious general. His commander Sulla is now sort of coming into his own politically. And around this time, Mithridates, the king of Pontus, starts causing problems over in the east. What kind of problems? Well, one of the things he sort of specialized in was piracy. The Mediterranean. Where's that picture? I think I probably broke down. I noticed that this time it gave me a signal, so I did not talk. Yeah, just a second. Good. I'm not exactly sure what's going on with my connection. Sometimes it goes in and out here. So Mithridates is sort of causing problems for the. Hang on a sec. Sorry. Mithridates is basically supporting these pirates in the Eastern Mediterranean and causing problems for the Roman Senate. The pirates would basically, what would happen is as ships were passing through the areas around Greece with the islands or whatever, they would come out and steal Roman ships. They would steal the cargo that they were carrying, and it was becoming a problem. So Sulla is given the command, and this is Sulla's big chance to sort of gain fame, gain control, become the new big man at Rome. And so he's very excited about this. But before that can happen, somebody comes along and passes a law basically stripping or attempts to basically strip Sulla of the command and give it back to Marius. This drives Sulla crazy, and at this point, basically, the two, Marius and Sulla, sort of become enemies. Here's where things get crazy. Sulla was supposed to give up, who is supposed to give up his command, and be replaced by a council the following year, arranges to have that person murdered and marches with his army on Rome, on the city of Rome, and so basically invades Rome to take this valuable command, because he would have a chance to go into the east and gain wealth and power from defeating Mithridates. He steals it back by force. Marius gets out of Dodge. He actually, I think, flees to Spain, goes into exile, Spain, and Sulla takes control and heads off to the east to fight Mithridates. Sulla is a very able commander. He does a great job dealing with Mithridates. Doesn't kill him. In fact, Mithridates will show back up later in the story of what goes on in this period, but he sort of ends up laying siege to the city of Athens and eventually beats Mithridates back and sort of restores control to that part of the world. So he accomplishes what the Roman Senate wants, even if he does it in a sort of autocratic way and stealing control from Mithridates. Now, Marius is not gone, though, however, and while Sulla is away from Rome, Marius, with the help of another guy named Cinna, or Cinna is sometimes pronounced, basically rally their forces and arrange to sort of basically start to dominate things in Rome while Sulla is away. And so you have sort of you start to see this pattern of individuals gaining lots of military support to dominate the affairs of the state. And so Marius comes back from exile. He's now at Rome. He's backed by this guy Cinna. And the two of them are sort of passing laws. Marius is elected consul again for 2 times, which makes him I think he's 7 consulships total, the longest serving consul in Roman history, which is also highly irregular. And there's sort of this like rivalry going on, and you can sort of see at this point already that the traditional republican government is no longer really functioning. It's really giving way to these individuals who amass large amounts of power and dominate the affairs of the state. They hold the consulship, they hold offices, but they're not respecting the rules. They're running for multiple consulships time after another. They're fighting with each other. It's really civil war, a sort of civil war at this point, although it hasn't gotten as bad as it eventually will yet, even though you have these huge superpowers. So Sulla is away. Marius and Cinna are in Rome, sort of dominating affairs, and eventually Sulla has had enough of this, and he knows he needs to return home to Rome. So he kind of presses pause on the Mithridatic campaign over in the east. He's won. He's really dealt with Mithridates and the piracy problem to a degree, and he returns to Rome to basically reclaim control of the city. Meanwhile, Marius and Cinna have enacted all sorts of popular reforms. They try to make changes to the Senate. They try to sort of support popular sovereignty and the general people against the sort of nobiles in the Senate. And so you have a sort of populist versus elite tension going on. When Sulla returns, he makes short work of Marius and Cinna. Marius, they basically clear out of the city, and Sulla regains power and begins to sort of assert himself with extreme brutality. So he undoes all of the populist reforms that Marius had tried to put into play. He passes a law that, oh, sorry. Excuse me one second. My phone is ringing. Sorry about that. I had these earpods in and my phone rang. And so it was ringing in my ears. Where was I? All right, the Sullan reform. So Sulla comes back. He clears Marius and Cinna out of the city and proceeds to sort of undo all of the populist reforms that Marius and Cinna had enacted. He increases the size of the Senate and stacks it with people who support him. The other thing that he does is he sort of clears Roman society of anybody who he's had problems with, and he does this through a new sort of very brutal new policy, which is known as prescription. So what prescription is in Latin, I'll type that out. Let me see if I can, know if I can write on here. Doesn't look like it. Well, I wrote it in the chat, and I'll add it to the slide before I share it. What proscription is basically you write the names of people who are considered enemies of the state. And when someone is proscribed, it basically they're kind of like a wanted man, but anybody can enact justice upon them. So basically, you can deliver their head to the state and then get their property, get a reward. Really, what happens is when someone's prescribed, their property is sort of forfeited to the state. So probably what people would do is turn kind of like a Wild West wanted poster. Exactly. Yeah. Wanted dead or alive. And you probably what would happen is you would get a reward. I don't think that you would get to keep the property of the people who were killed. I think it eventually went to the state and then they would distribute it in various ways. But it did basically allow, I mean, it made it impossible for these people. They would have to leave Rome and go into exile or be killed because anybody walking down the street would be your enemy. And there are stories of, fathers turning in sons, sons turning in fathers, families turning against each other. And it basically made you an enemy of the people and anybody could get away with harming you. And so Sulla did this. At first it was just a few people, but it grew into this like massive purge of Roman society. I think in the end it was something like 1,600 people who were killed through these prescriptions. And this is the first time we see it, but we're going to see it again because all of the conflict that we're seeing with Marius and Sulla and the stuff that we saw before with some of these other nobles is just going to get worse in the next generation. Okay, so that's sort of where we're going from here. A couple things to note. Remember the Battle of Aurazio, where there was that massive defeat of the Romans by these Gallic tribes? There were some major changes made in the army at this time, and they're not exactly sure when, but it's probable that the military experience of Marius and Sulla and their expeditions with Mithridates or whatever led to a couple changes in the way the army was working. One was the replacing the maniple with the cohort system. This was not really a change in terms of the way the army functioned as much as it was replacing the number of people in the army. So previously, there had been about 4,800 people in a legion. They expanded the legion to 6,000 men and organized them in larger groups called cohorts, which still sort of used manipular forms to fight. So it's sort of just like an expansion of the size of the legion. The other big change is that they started bringing people from similar places in Italy. And this may have had to do with the expansion of citizenship all throughout Italy. So instead of basically Romans being selected from throughout the 38 tribes of Rome and then augmented with some Italian allies, you now have legions being largely comprising people from one or another area of Italy. So what ends up happening is like you have generals who have people who all come from the same place. They all know each other, and this increases the phenomenon of the soldiers being more loyal to their generals than they are to the Roman state. And we've been seeing an increase in this as we go through time. So we saw it already early on in some of the Eastern campaigns. It gets worse to the point where, Sulla's army is basically willing to invade Rome to get this lucrative campaign over in the east away from Marius after it was, basically the campaign was sort of stripped from Sulla and given to Marius. Sorry for that siren. Let that pass. I live right near a hospital, so every once in a while, ambulances go by. The last the last like military modification that happens during this period is the pilum. So and the gladius as well. So they adopt a short thrusting sword. They sort of change the sword, which I guess works better in a manipulatory function. I'm not exactly sure what. That doesn't make such a major change, but they also introduced this new throwing spear. What's interesting about the pilum is it's designed to break. So the Romans would throw the spear at their enemies first. The idea was that it would pierce the shield and then bend. The weight of the shaft would cause the spear to bend and stick in, and so basically it would make their shields useless. So that's another just sort of interesting military innovation at that period. Okay, so now Sulla remains in office. He's dominated the affairs of state. He's sort of made a bunch of reforms to the way the government works. He also set something up so that you can't hold the same office more than once. He also limits the abilities of the tribunes, makes it impossible for them to hold office above tribune. So he's really trying to prevent the popular uprisings that came with the Gracchi. He's sort of trying to like go back to the old republic. And what's amazing about Sulla is he has absolute power at this point. He completely controls the Roman state. He's in control of all the army. He's brought a huge amount of wealth back from the east. He's eliminated all of his enemies, and he could have stayed in power and basically been, dictator for life or turned himself into a king at Rome. But he doesn't do this. And no one knows why, but basically he retires. He goes back to sort of private life. He goes down to southern Italy and proceeds to just sort of drink himself to death while writing his memoirs. And it's one of the great questions of Roman history, sort of why did Sulla do this? Why does he choose to lay down power? Because the people behind him, you're going to see, are not like that. They actually start grasping for power. And obviously the culmination of this is Julius Caesar, who basically becomes sort of like a king, although he doesn't call it that, and has no intention of laying down power. Sulla steps back and tries to let the traditional republican forms of government sort of continue at Rome, but it is not to be. Okay. Two other things happen that I want to talk about at this time. One is basically they're both problems for people who you're going to see become major players in what is known as the Roman Revolution. And when I say the Roman Revolution, what I mean is the transition from a republican form of government, which has been in effect since 509 BC, when the kings were kicked out of Rome, to an empire that's governed by one man. You can see that, like, with each of these people, Gracchus, Marius, Sulla, we're getting closer and closer to one-man rule and domination of the state, but we never quite get there. All of the people who I mentioned from now on are going to be the players in the drama that unfolds around basically the Civil War, the Roman Civil War, and then eventually the ascendance of Julius Caesar as a dictator for life and basically sort of like a pseudo-emperor, his assassination, and then the rise of Augustus as the first emperor of Rome. Okay. One thing that happens at this time is a really epic gladiator-led rebellion. So the movie Gladiator is not about this particular episode, but it is inspired by it. And actually, there is a great movie called Spartacus, which you can watch. I forget who's in it. I want to say Charlton Heston, or maybe it's Martin Sheen, a young Martin Sheen. Do you know, Morgan? He's typing. The suspense is killing me. Kirk Douglas. That's who it is, right? Sorry. I've never actually seen it. Maybe we should have movie night one night in class. That would be good. So yeah, if you're looking for something to do later tonight, bring up Spartacus on iTunes, and you can read about this. But basically, what happens is there is a rebellion of gladiators. Great, that would be great, Angela, if you could share. There's a rebellion of gladiators, which grows into sort of a massive rural slave rebellion. So Spartacus is a gladiator. He and a group of other gladiators at Rome sort of escape from their training camp or from the Colosseum or whatever, and proceed to run from the city down into southern Italy and build a camp. Now, this dealing with this gladiatorial rebellion should have been sort of like a minor police action, like, okay, there's some like rebellious slaves, go clean them up and deal with them. But for whatever reason, the Romans just cannot get this thing under control. And the slaves eventually like barricade themselves on Mount Vesuvius down outside of Naples. And it takes 2 years to defeat this ragtag group of sort of rebels, who would have included probably slaves from all the Roman households throughout southern Italy. People wonder sort of what exactly, there's a lot of controversy about how this exactly went. For instance, how is it possible that gladiators who had no, of course they were trained to fight in spectacular ways, but gladiators were kind of like professional wrestlers. They weren't serious soldiers, and they certainly weren't generals. So how is it that they were able to hold out for years against the Roman army? The Spartacan-led rebellion took 2 years to put down. They send several, at first they send some like praetors or quaestors down there to deal with them. They're sort of, they're totally beaten back. They mop the floor with them. And they hold out for a long time, until eventually you get this guy, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus is just sort of an unscrupulous businessman at Rome. He eventually amasses a massive fortune. His one of the activities that he's known for is he would have a personal fire brigade, and he would go into the Roman slums and set an apartment building on fire. And then he'd be standing there with his fire brigade while the apartment building was burning down, and he would buy the burning apartments from people and basically say, like, look, I'll take your apartment from you, and I'll pay you 10% of what it's worth, and you can either take that or I'll just let it burn. And then the people would give him money, and then he would put the fire out and own the building. So a very unscrupulous guy. He eventually puts down the slave rebellion, and to make a point, fire sale, right? Very good. To make a point, he does something really horrible, which is sort of outlined in this picture here. He crucifies, and crucifixion, obviously we know it from Christianity, from the fate of Jesus. But crucifixion was the sort of favored punishment for putting slaves and other undesirable people to death. In fact, one of the rights of being a Roman citizen was being able to be killed by decapitation. Having a quick, easy death was a privilege of citizenship. And if you weren't a citizen, you're a slave, you would be killed in this gruesome way, where you're nailed to a cross, and your body slides down the cross, and I think actually you die. You die from choking to death because your body slides down and your sort of lungs close in. It's horrible. Is it Marcus Latinus who crucifies these people? No, Crassus. Marcus Licinius Crassus is his name. And he doesn't just crucify one. This is what's really horrible. He crucifies 5,000 people, and that's what this picture is here. I don't know if you can see the sort of all the different crosses all off sort of as far as I can see, all up and down the Appian Way, because the rebels had seceded to southern Italy and sort of set up shop on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. And so the crucifixions were designed to be a sign, all these dying men nailed to crosses for miles and miles, was designed to be sort of a sign to any slave who thought about rebelling in the future, that this was going to be what happened to them if they messed with the Roman state. So really horrible, brutal. And this is the sort of type of character that we're dealing with here in these like final days of the Republic. So that's one major conflict. The other is that Mithridates of Pontus comes back. So after Sulla has put him down over in the east, he suddenly returns, and the piracy gets even worse and is getting really out of hand. So the Romans, to deal with this, yeah, Hunger Games for sure. The Romans, to deal with Mithridates, I'll go just to keep ourselves sort of on topic here. To deal with Mithridates, now turn to another major figure who is sort of on the political scene. And this guy's name is Gnaeus Pompeius, and he'll be called Pompeius Magnus, because the result of this command makes Pompey sort of like the new Sulla, the most powerful, richest man in the world. And so basically what they do is they say, okay, Mithridates is back, things are worse than before. We've got to clear not just the East, but the entire Mediterranean of piracy. And in order to do this, we need to grant Pompey a degree of power that is sort of unprecedented in Roman politics. And so Pompey is given something that is called Imperium Maius, Greater Imperium. You'll probably remember from our earlier lectures that Imperium was this sort of absolute power that the magistrates had. It was symbolized by the fasces, and it basically meant the ability to just sort of kill anyone at any time for anything. Pompey is given this, but he's given it as a private citizen, and he's given jurisdiction over the entire sort of empire. This is unprecedented and sort of makes him even more emperor-like than Sulla was. Pompey, like Sulla, is an amazing general. He proceeds to sort of, kick butt all over the East. Mithridates is killed, and piracy is eliminated from basically the whole Mediterranean. Over the course of this, Pompey amasses an enormous fortune, and then returns to Rome and has a triumph over Mithridates. He's paraded through the streets. He's back at Rome. He's a sort of superstar. He has all this power, and he basically proceeds to dominate affairs at Rome, together with Crassus, who is the consul with him in 70 BC. Another few faces, wrapping things up here. Oh, my battery is low. Let me see. Hang on one second, guys. Let me plug in. Any questions on any of this stuff before I move on to Cicero and Caesar? I see Morgan's typing. I'll just wait for whatever he's going to say. It's interesting to think of Pompey as having more money than Crassus. Well, I believe at this time he does. Crassus is so. What will happen basically is that as Crassus and Pompey come back to Rome and start to sort of dominate affairs there, a couple other people will pop up, and that was about what I was just sort of going to get to. And as things sort of shake out, Crassus will enrich himself, and to the point where he eventually becomes wealthier than Pompey, who becomes, although they're rivals, they strike a sort of weird alliance. Let me just mention a few more of those people, and then we'll sort of talk about what happens there. So the first is a young guy named Marcus Tullius Cicero. So Cicero, as he's known. So Cicero is another novus homo, like Marius, who comes on the scene right around this time. He is an amazing orator, probably the best public speaker that Rome has ever seen, a great politician, very shrewd, and he's extremely famous. He's also he's famous because we know a lot about him. So in addition to a great number of his orations, which have been preserved, he is also we have preserved his personal letters. So Romans were all great letter writers, and they would send letters all around the empire about every little thing, kind of like in a way that we email each other today. However, most can other people hear me? Angela is saying she can't hear. Angela, it must be on your end. I'm sorry about that. If you're having trouble with the audio, you can call the number on the phone to join, or just don't sweat it. I'm almost done, and like I said, this is all being recorded, so you'll have a chance to go in and listen to it. Or maybe try refreshing your browser, or try rejoining. That might work. Where was I? All right, Cicero. So Cicero is one person to watch out for. He just sort of pops up in this chapter. He doesn't play a major role in the drama that's unfolding yet, except for one thing that he does do. So in 63 BC, he manages to fight off. Basically, he becomes consul as a novus homo, like Marius did, the first one in his family. He's also from Arpinum, actually, so the same town. And at that time, there is a sort of disaffected, downtrodden nobleman named Catiline, Lucius Sergius Catiline, who plots a conspiracy to overthrow the state. And Cicero exposes this conspiracy, and basically this group of nobles that wants to destroy the state is put down. Cicero actually has them murdered without a trial, strangled in the Mamertine prison at Rome, and this is he's actually exiled for this. Morgan is typing again. I'll wait for his question. He does. So Catiline is involved in this. He gives a series of what's called Catilinarian orations, 4 of them. And he basically, those orations serve to expose the conspiracy, tell the Senate about what's going on. So he addresses the Senate about this conspiracy of noblemen who want to murder him and a number of other prominent figures at Rome and sort of take control of the state. He discovers this. While he's consul, he actually has a number of conspirators strangled without a trial. And because of this, he's eventually actually exiled from Rome. But he'll be back, and he plays a major role in the civil war that is coming. But again, he's partially so famous because we have so much of his stuff. So we have a great number of his personal letters. We have the texts of his orations. Angela is having problems. Sorry about that. I might send her an email real quick and just tell her to join by phone. All right, I let her know. Okay, the other major figure here, who again is just kind of introduced in this chapter, is Julius Caesar. And obviously he's a name that you've all heard before. He's a major figure in Roman history. This is Caesar at the beginning of his career. So Caesar is a young guy in Roman politics when sort of Crassus and Pompey are consuls. And he sort of comes into play and starts to make a name for himself. He's elected Pontifex Maximus. He's also an amazing speaker. In fact, some people think, although we don't have any of Caesar's speeches like we do for Cicero, so we can't maybe tell, but some people think that he may have been actually a better speaker than Cicero. And where Cicero aligns himself with Pompey, Caesar, at the beginning of his career, although he's he's changing all the time, at the beginning he's more of a popular hero. And so he's ingratiating himself to the people, building a reputation. He's also spending money like crazy, and he's borrowing money from all sorts of people at Rome and indebting himself. One of his main creditors is actually Crassus. At a certain point, Crassus, Caesar, and Pompey get together and sort of decide to dominate affairs at Rome. It's sort of like an unofficial political alliance, which is known as the First Triumvirate. It's partially known as that because there will eventually be a second triumvirate. But what you have here is a group of extremely powerful individuals sort of circling the state and trying to gain power and dominate things, kind of in the way Sulla did, but now there's three of them. Now, as you can probably suspect, things are not going to work out well for this group. Angela, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking me to repeat, but since this is going to be recorded, you can just go back and consult the recording, and everything should be there. Okay. So as things pass, eventually, basically, Caesar is becoming a very popular figure at Rome, in Roman politics. He teams up with Pompey and Crassus. They're sort of dominating affairs at state. So Caesar at this point, though, has spent a ton of money getting himself popular. At one point, he serves as idol and puts on very expensive games. It's the largest gladiatorial competition that's ever happened at Rome, which he pays for with money that he doesn't have. So he's in debt, and he needs to get money. So basically what Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar do is they divide up various roles to enrich themselves and gain power. And Caesar gets a command of Gaul, which includes Transalpine Gaul, which is the part of Gaul beyond the Alps. That's what Transalpine means. And also Illyria, which is kind of like modern day Croatia. So he goes off to Gaul for this period of 5 years. Theoretically, it's to sort of like defend the borders, but really what it is a booty and plunder campaign to conquer Gaul and enrich himself so that he can pay off his debts and make his move to try to gain power at Rome. Pompey and Crassus each go off in their own direction, enriching themselves in various ways, and that is sort of where things stand. What's going to happen is that these people are going to turn against each other, particularly Caesar and Pompey. There's going to be a massive civil war. I won't spoil the surprise, but you probably know that Julius Caesar comes out on top. And that's what we're going to be getting into next week. So really we're at the heart, we're really right on the eve of the Roman Revolution. And we've been able to trace these individuals accumulating power for themselves over time, particularly first Marius, then Sulla, then Pompey and Crassus and Caesar sort of all together. And you've had increasing issues where the state itself is breaking down. Various factors are conspiring to allow individual personalities to amass power, control, influence, money, far beyond what any individual had before. So it's setting the stage for a revolution and for the end of sort of republican representative government and move back towards monarchy, but an imperial form of monarchy rather than a small monarchy like you have at the beginning of Rome. So that is my lecture for this week. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them now. If not, I don't see any hands or chatting or any signs that anyone's typing. If not, I will share the notes. In fact, I think I already have for chapter 3. I will share this PowerPoint presentation. And then some of you have asked about help preparing for the quizzes. I'm going to offer a optional study session, review session earlier this week later this week. We'll do it one night before the quiz. It'll be quick, 15, 20 minutes just to go through. And I just basically want to just give people some basic hints on how to prepare and sort of what information I'm looking for on the various terms that you guys need to prepare and memorize for the quiz. So does anyone have any questions about that? That'd be great. Good. All right. So thanks everyone for attending. This actually, there were a few difficulties with with various problems, internet, babies, noises of various kinds, power, but it more or less worked. Thanks for showing up and being able to stay on point. And I will, yes, I owe some of you quizzes. I'll take care of that actually right now. Mail them out to you. All right. All right, everyone. Have a great night, and I will see you next Monday. We'll do a little bit of checking in before the quiz too, if anyone has questions, just because we didn't have a full class. So I'll give like a sort of 15-minute period to just check in if people feel like they need it. All right. Have a great week, everyone. Bye-bye.